Hello. This is the first of four relatively brief lectures we'll have on utilitarianism. This one is basically an introduction to it. Last time, in looking at the what's something like the social history of the development of the artificial kidney, we saw that the criteria for the selection of patients naturally lend itself to consideration of consequences of making such a decision. And the reaction to the consequentialist criteria went the other way. It led to considerations that were more formalist, that were based on considerations other than consequences, such as respect for persons, human dignity, rights, and so on. So that set up our consideration of moral theory and the two varieties that are most prominent. As we know, ethics is concerned with right action, particularly doing things for right reasons. And from an ethical point of view, there are two significant features of actions: intentions and consequences. And the theories, ethical theories, tend to differ largely by the relative importance they give to either of those. So we'll consider both, beginning with the consequentialist theory, utilitarianism. Utilitarianism comes out of England in the 18th century, just as Kant's theory is an Enlightenment ethical theory. And again, let's recall that the Enlightenment is the cultural period of dissemination of the principles of the scientific revolution, that we can understand the world, that it's assuming that it's rationally based. Science makes a distinction between myself, the subject, and the world, the object, and that I can figure out. The assumption is that I can figure out how the world works, that it behaves rationally, and I can discover those principles and obtain knowledge on the basis of that. That a picture of the world that I make is then tested to see whether it corresponds to the facts, how the world actually is. By the time that so that's the 17th century. By the time we get to the 18th century, that basic idea now is extended to other areas of life, including morality. So both of our theories are instances of that confidence that it's possible to figure things out and conduct oneself in a rational way. We said that utilitarianism comes out of England mainly. So this is the England of the Industrial Revolution with Bentham, two main utilitarians, Jeremy Bentham, born in 1748, died in 1832, John Stuart Mill, a little more than a generation later, born in 1806, died in 1873. So Bentham is right in the midst of the Industrial Revolution in England, and Mill also, and Mill is a Victorian figure. So if we think about this, just the social environment of the development of utilitarianism, think of what's going on in England in this time. We have England, Paris, two of the great cities of Europe, are almost exponentially increasing in size. With the Industrial Revolution, we have social transformation. This is production, factories, people working 7 days a week with their children alongside them, because there's no such thing as daycare. This is, and we have Karl Marx is in London at the same time that Mill is. This is the time of the development of social science. Recall Christmas Carol, Dickens. Dickens is there too. Scrooge and A Christmas Carol, that the wealthy businessmen come around and are seeking donations for the poor. And Scrooge is made to say, are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses any longer? Better to let the surplus population die. That's Dickens parodying Thomas Malthus and Ricardo and their the beginnings of well, economics, social science. So let's consider right away the principle of utility. This is the principle which, recall that normative ethical theory's main purpose is to explain what it is that makes actions right and wrong. And they give us as a byproduct a principle that supposedly we can use to make decisions. That's certainly true of utilitarianism. So one way we can state that the principle is that action is right, that produces at least as much utility as any other action possible under the circumstances for all those affected. And right away, utility is just a term for value. And a lot of theory, as we'll see, goes into determining what that single standard of value is. A lot of utilitarian theorists differ largely in terms of what they take the standard to be. There's the slogan that goes with this, the greatest good for the greatest number. I've heard that. Why not use that? That's easier than the principle that we just mentioned. Well, let's look at it again. What's the difference? The action is right that produces at least as much utility as any other action possible under the circumstances. One interesting feature of utilitarianism is that it makes dilemmas impossible. A dilemma, in a loose sense, is just any hard decision. In a strict sense, though, a dilemma is a decision situation where the reasons for one option go against equally good reasons for another option. So it's your classical no-win situation. Whatever option you choose, you're going against reasons that are just as good that are incompatible with those. That doesn't happen in utilitarianism, because the only thing that matters is that the action that you choose be the one that maximizes utility, that maximizes value. So if you have two actions that produce an equal quantity of utility, toss a coin. Doesn't matter which one you choose. Second feature of interest here is that what it is that makes the principle of utility a moral principle and not a maxim of prudence. Now, notice that utilitarianism so far looks like straightforward practical rationality. It just makes sense, instrumental rationality. That's pretty much how we understand rationality in our time. That it's rational to choose the option that gets you what you want with the fewest costs. So what's the difference between this and a principle of a maxim of prudence? This being a moral principle, it's telling us that we must consider everybody affected by the action. This is the easiest mistake to make in applying utilitarianism, that we limit consideration to the utility of the decision maker. We can't do that. Principle says we must consider everyone affected by the action. Let's consider next the standard of utility itself. Importantly, there is just one, that everything that has value must be measurable in terms of the single standard that we choose. So there must be some conditions on such a standard, and there are. First off, the standard must be bipolar. That is, it must admit of both positive and negative instances. Bentham's standard, pleasure, admits of pain, positive and negative. Mill chose happiness as a standard of utility. And of course, it corresponds to unhappiness, the negative side. Why must this be? Well, some decision situations are such that maximizing utility is actually better described as minimizing disutility. If all of your options are bad, if all come out net less than zero, then our task is to choose the option that is the least bad under those circumstances. Beyond, so isn't that true of all value concepts? Interestingly, no. There are some concepts that are monopolar. Consider worth. The worst you can have relative to worth is worthlessness, zero. Further, I can use some alliteration here. Whatever the standard is must be comparable. That is, it must be possible to compare different quantities of value using the same standard. Different kinds of things must be measurable in terms of a common standard. Calculable, that is, the standard has to be fine-grained enough that it can capture relatively small differences in quantities. And cumulative. It must be a concept such that we can take all of the utility that we're concerned with and put it together and end up, and these are different kinds of value, or put all the utility together and we end up with a quantity that's understandable, that's measurable. So the basic idea then is that any action which can be evaluated has consequences which can be measured in terms of a common standard of value, which has both positive and negative poles. For each action, then, it's possible in principle to measure all the amounts of, say, pleasure produced for different people and add those up, to do the same thing for pain, to subtract the sum of pain from the sum of pleasure. The right action is that with the greatest positive or least negative balance of pain over pleasure. So as you notice, one of the PowerPoint slides gives us that basic outline of the procedure. First thing we do is to identify our options. Of course, that's going to be the case, whatever theory we're using. Second, to determine all the direct and indirect costs and benefits produced by each option for each affected person. What's the difference between direct and indirect? So I'll say time. Time would be an indirect cost. It's going to take time to do these calculations. The theory has to be practical. It has to do what it says it's going to do. And that's very difficult for utilitarian. Can you imagine measuring all the quantities of utility, of pleasure, happiness, whatever a standard is, for each affected individual? It's going to take forever. So there's going to have to be some way of having a shortcut here, and we'll discuss that later on. All right, so identify your options. For each option, determine all the direct and indirect costs and benefits that there are. Sum together all the costs, sum together all the benefits, total. Subtract the sum of costs from the sum of benefits. Choose the option that produces the greatest net utility. Net sum of benefits over costs, or as we said, depending on what the circumstances are, the least disutility. Notice it's a net utility. It's because the option that produces the greatest total utility might also produce the greatest total costs. We're interested in the net effect. So it has a lot going for it. It seems extremely rational, doesn't it? And that's why our selection committee reached immediately for consequentialist sorts of considerations. Utilitarianism satisfies a presumption that ethical actions should be unselfish and that moral principles should be fair. It provides a coherent system of conduct. All decisions flow from a single category of value, Whereas in other theories, you sometimes find a multiplicity of independent rules and principles arbitrarily thrown together, seemingly. It seems a common sense approximation of morality. At least that's what the utilitarians thought. It's a very popular theory among people like policymakers, as you might think. It's fair, as Bentham says. Each person counts for one, no one counts for more than one. It's dispassionate. Let's consider some misunderstandings that it's important for us to avoid. We mentioned one already. First, that we should not limit consideration to the decision maker's utility. It's a natural thing to do because utilitarianism seems so much like straightforward cost-benefit rationality. But as the principle tells us, we must consider everybody affected by the action. Second, we shouldn't choose an option just because its utility nets out positively. Why might we, instead of choosing the option that produces the greatest net utility, might we make that mistake? Because ordinarily when we're making a decision, we have a favored option. And if we see that it nets out positively, we might stop there. Again, we can't. We have to choose the option that produces the greatest net utility. And third, we can't limit consideration to immediate consequences. We have to consider all foreseeable consequences. Why might we make that mistake? Well, once again, because if we're in a decision situation, we have, for making a decision, it's because we're looking for a particular set of consequences. And if we see that they will be achieved, we may limit our consideration to those. Instead, we have to look at all foreseeable consequences. That's daunting. It can be daunting. Plutonium has a half-life of 20,000 years, I think. How about that for consequences? Bentham and Mill didn't have to worry about it. We did. We'll see the utilitarian has an out there. So let's consider finally, in this lecture, one summation of the advantages of utilitarianism. Bernard Williams, who is a critic of utilitarianism, still does a very nice job of adducing its main advantages. So he gives us four. First, that the main value of utilitarianism is, as he puts it, non-transcendental. That is, it's measurable. Whatever our standard of value is, must be something that's measurable. Second, pretty much following from the first, our basic standard of value will be minimally problematic. Pleasure, happiness, most people think that those are morally important. Even Kant taught that. Third, under utilitarianism, moral issues can be decided by calculation of their consequences. This means there's an objective answer to any moral problem. And that's because for utilitarian, it's the world that decides. I'm going to say this repeatedly. For utilitarian, it's the world that decides, that determines whether an action is right or wrong. Not something about us, but something about the world. That's an extremely attractive characteristic of utilitarianism. One right answer for everybody. That means if one starts with the same data that somebody else gets, then everybody should get the same answer if you do the basic arithmetic properly. And last, it gives us then a common currency of moral thought. Different concerns of different parties, different sorts of claims, all can be cashed out in terms of a quantity of our utility standard. And that demands, of course, that there be one standard of utility. So it's very attractive theory. The next lecture will consider Bentham, how one utilitarian actually goes about thinking about this. The third will be the distinction between act and rule utilitarianism and why there is such a distinction, what it means. And the last, in the conclusion part of our consideration, will be the problems that utilitarianism faces. And we'll find those to be, from my point of view, at least as interesting as the positive exposition of the theory.